You saw in the previous video, in our textual analysis of chapter 13 verses 1 through 10, that the 10 nations of Daniel 2 and 7 really did come out of the collapse of the Roman Empire, thus fulfilling Daniel's prophecy. You also saw that John begins chapter 13 echoing the 10 horns from Daniel, 3 of which would be destroyed, leaving 7 kingdoms in Europe, precisely as we have today. And you saw that this historical information is traced in Gibbon's monumental work, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, thus connecting the two texts. Despite the 5 flimsy excuses presented by the Counter-Reformation that they never happened, despite the fact they did. The Counter-Reformation's 5 flimsy excuses are in reality self-nullifying. Because on the one hand they claim the 10 kingdoms did not occur because reconstitutions do not count. And on the other hand, claim it will all be fulfilled in a future reconstitution of the Roman Empire. But that would mean geopolitical reconstitutions do count, which would also mean then, it's already happened. And there is no need for a future reconstitution for these things to be fulfilled. You also saw that the Roman Empire gives the beast its power and authority, which are clearly described as an absolute monarchy. And you saw that the Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD. Meaning there no longer exists a Roman Caesar to grant that authority to the Antichrist or beast. Futurists no longer have the Roman Empire to grant that authority. If they say it will be reconstituted in another form, then they violate their own 5 talking points about why Daniel's 10 kingdoms were not fulfilled. Because they say in their own criticisms, that any reconstitutions do not count. You obviously can't have it both ways. You also saw that John prophesies the Antichrist will come to the city of Ephesus. And he locates the Antichrists plural, that he is talking about, to be in Ephesus, and later in Revelation states these same Antichrists in Ephesus are the Nicolaitans. And that while these self-identified Christians whom John identified as Nicolaitans, were in reality Roman syncretists, they also falsely claimed to actually be apostles. But John notes that they were not. And instead, he notes they used intentional deceit, as a religious practice, to give themselves credibility and spread their religious views. Counter-Reformation futurists have no city of Ephesus for a future Antichrist to come to. And Counter-Reformation preterists cannot explain how Nero, who died in 68 AD, could have come to Ephesus, after John wrote that prophecy, to the city of Ephesus in 110 AD 42 years after his death. Furthermore, since Nero was no longer in power, and his legacy was one of ill repute, there would have been absolutely no reason to use some sort of secret code to refer to him. John could have simply written his name into the text, without any political recrimination. Nero was both disgraced and dead. There was absolutely no motivation for John to hide his name in a secret code that you had to decipher to get to, and furthermore, as counter-reformationists already fully know, the text says to enumerate, not calculate. John never told anyone to use a secret calculation to figure out how to read the name of Nero. The claim is a complete fabrication. If you are not willing to tell the truth about Christmas, you will never be able to really teach the book of Revelation, because Christmas is a big part of what John is prophesying about in the book of Revelation. If you refuse to see that, then you are refusing to see what is actually written in the book. And you have to resort to distortions and obfuscations to teach it. Which is precisely what the Counter-Reformation does. And thus why you can never depend on a Counter-Reformationist minister to honestly teach the book of Revelation. References to Christmas, either directly or indirectly, have been in the historic center of John's prophecies, in chapter 9, 10, 11, 12 and now with the mouth and the solstice fish, and later the image of the beast. You are going to see how it is brought up again, in chapter 13. And the 7-branched temple menorah, the centerpiece of the Feast of Dedication, reflected in 42 lists of 7, throughout the entire book, point directly and unmistakably at the historical identity of the biblical Antichrist. In an unmistakable way. As you will soon see.
I am a counter-reformation Christian, and I will not get left behind. I have accepted Apollo Ge Zeus, which is the sun, into my solar plexus heart chakra. I am ready for the rapture. Oh look. It's the rapture. Now. I am getting raptured.
As pointed out in the previous video, the Jesuits who came up with futurism and preterism were not actually trying to teach the text in Revelation. They were trying to change what was taught about it, so that it would not implicate the Roman papacy. They really didn't care what the text actually taught. Their intent was simply to obfuscate what it did teach, so that it no longer posed a political problem for the Vatican. So when ministers today adopt these eschatologies as their own, what they are doing in reality is obfuscating and hiding the text, whether they know that is what they are doing or not. The result is the same, either way. When it comes to chapter 13, the counter-reformationist minister has a number of fibs he will have to tell to get around what chapter 13 is really talking about. In some cases, the counter-reformationist minister is simply not intelligent enough to actually know he is being used to pass on these lies, invented by Jesuits to protect the papacy. But in many, if not most cases, they do know they are having to lie. The reason they become conscious of the fact they are lying is because of all the contradictions their lies create with what they know they are reading for themselves in the text. It's not that these ministers do not know any better. It's just that they do not care any better to know. The very reason for their job, for which they get paid to be a minister, for whatever group or institution that is giving them their salary, is ultimately to spread that disinformation. It is literally their job to pass along whatever they have been told to say. It is not their job to decide what it is they are going to say. And when the hierarchy of who they are working for see they are deviating from what they have been told to say, they will be quickly reminded who they work for. They are told what they are supposed to say about Revelation, and it is not their personal decision, unless they wish to lose their job. So, most of these ministers will simply mindlessly repeat whatever it is they have been told to say. And in return for that lack of scrutiny, they will receive a regular paycheck. They may not even believe what they are preaching, but they have no choice in the matter if they wish to continue to receive their income. So these policies create a tremendous amount of problems for ministers who want to discharge their duties as a minister and still maintain the integrity of a conscience. When the counter-reformation minister gets to chapter 13, the counter-reformationist minister creates major contradictions and is forced to do a number of textual gymnastics and grammatical backflips. Major portions of the text in chapter 13, have to be either quietly ignored, or simply openly lied about. Before we cover the historical fulfillment of John's first prophecy, we are going to look at 13 major contradictions the Counter-Reformation minister creates in his explanation of Revelation chapter 13. There are 13 major contradictions you can objectively spot to see they are openly and intentionally lying to you. And you should look for these 13 major contradictions whenever you hear a counter-reformationist minister explaining Revelation chapter 13, because they will always be, either explicitly or implicitly, present in all their explanations. Both Jesuit preterism and futurism create not only ridiculous distortions, but major contradictions as well, in handling these texts in Revelation. So we are going to bring out major contradiction again, to highlight 13 contradictions counter-reformation ministers create in the way they attempt to hide Revelation 13. The first major contradiction they create is over the issue of the city of Ephesus itself, which begins as early as Revelation chapter 2. First, preterism, which tries to place everything under the rule of Nero, is so ridiculous, most people are never deceived by it. We have already mentioned how Nero never went to Ephesus. Nero died in 68 AD, long before John's prophecies. And John prophesied the Antichrist was coming to the city of Ephesus between 95 and 110 AD. 3 decades after Nero had already died and had been buried. Preterists tried to get themselves out of this jam by claiming that John was so stupid, he thought Nero was going to resurrect and come back as the Antichrist, and thus his prophecies. It is an utterly fictitious fabrication. John believed no such thing, and his prophecies addressing the future, in which Nero had been dead and buried for decades, patently, had absolutely nothing to do with Nero. John was clearly prophesying something else, entirely. And John makes it very clear that the Antichrists, plural, he was talking about in Ephesus, were associated with the Nicolaitans. Nicolaitans were not simply pagan Romans. They called themselves Christians, and even claimed to be apostolic. Nero never claimed to be a Christian, and certainly, Nero did not consider himself to be an apostle of Christ. It is a patently ridiculous assertion to attempt to insert Nero's name into these prophecies. It fits nothing about them at all. And as you will see in the second prophecy, it doesn't even fit 666, which is the core of their entire claim. And as you will also see, in the second prophecy, John does not write that you are to use 666 to calculate anything. He says explicitly to count with pebbles, which means to enumerate, to count on a list in an ordinal fashion. Not mangle into another name entirely. Which is precisely what preterists do with 666 to get the name Nero. And they fully know the text says to enumerate, not calculate. But both Jesuit preterism and futurism make the critical mistake of completely ignoring John's prophecy that the Antichrist is going to come to Ephesus, given in 1 John. Because if either admit that fact, then both excuses are exposed as fraudulent. As repeatedly pointed out in the series, 666 begins with the city of Ephesus, which Nero never went to, eliminating preterism, and no longer exists today, thus eliminating futurism. The second major contradiction you will notice is that John is giving Christians very specific and important instructions in verses 9 and 10. Counter-reformationists, who advocate futurism, will constantly try to explain everything in the book of Revelation as happening after something they call the rapture. But as you have already seen in numerous videos, every place in the texts of Revelation, they try to stick their imaginary raptured doctrine. John is still addressing Christians afterwards, and even giving them instructions, just as you see here in chapter 13. If all the Christians have disappeared in a magical rapture, why is he clearly giving them very important instructions in verse 9 and 10? The answer is obviously that John had no such conception when he wrote the text. He was addressing Christians who were going to be living in the middle of the fulfillment of the events he was describing. And, so much so that, he tries to give them instructions for their welfare, prophetically, in the text. There is no rapture. Everyone is still on earth, including Christians. And the second part of that same contradiction is that, if John was referring to Nero, why would he be giving Christians instructions, 30 years ago, in the past? The answer is, he wouldn't. The third major contradiction the counter-reformation creates about chapter 13 is that its rapturalists will try to claim chapter 13 is happening at the end of the world. But John has already stated explicitly that the two witnesses in chapter 11 come 42 months after Jerusalem is given to the Gentiles. We know that happened in 130 AD. So according to the counter-reformationists' own dating scheme, all these events were done and over with by the year 138 AD. Which obviously didn't happen. So neither did their eschatology scheme. It's a completely invalid claim, because of chapter 11 verses 1 and 2. John explicitly tells you, it is wrong, in his own words. And for preterists, who claim this all refers to Nero, why would he prophesy an event in the year 130 AD, 30 years into the future, when Nero died in 68 AD? If he did come back from the dead, that date would have made him a 92-year-old Antichrist. How many 92-year-olds, do you know, who are capable of conquering the whole world? In the age of swords and chariots, when the average life expectancy was even less than 50 years of age? John had no such conception. And no preterist can point to any evidence, anywhere, biblical or historical, to prove John held and promoted that false notion. It is simply adopted, because it fits their false narrative. The fourth major contradiction they teach is that counter-reformation futurists teach all this is happening in something they call the tribulation. But John explicitly states in chapter 1 verse 9, he is in quote, the tribulation, and he uses both the definite article and the present tense in the Greek when he is writing the book. They just ignore that fact. Because they have to. They have no way to explain it. So, they just ignore it. The fifth major contradiction counter-reformationists teach is that chapter 13 is in chronological order, after chapter 11 and 12. But John refers to the beast already in power and the things he is doing with that power, in chapter 11 and 12, but in chapter 13, John describes how he comes to power. So it is obviously not in chronological order. They just ignore that fact. Because they have to. They have no way to explain that contradiction. So they just ignore it. The sixth major contradiction the counter-reformation teaches about Revelation chapter 13 is that Daniel's prophecy about 10 kingdoms rising from the fall of the Roman Empire, which John begins chapter 13 by making a reference to, never happened. They claim this is true because not everybody has the same lists, and they claim the remaining 7 kingdoms must exist until the return of Christ, and reconstitutions of kingdoms do not count. Except for the fact, they will also turn around and then claim the reconstitution of the Roman Empire, which is also part of the prophecy, will count, and will be future. Well, obviously if reconstitutions do not count for the 7 kingdoms, then how could it count for the Roman Empire? Daniel would have simply missed the prophecy. End of story. But the fact of the matter is that reconstitutions do count. The scriptures explicitly state reconstitutions do count. In Matthew chapter 3 verse 9, John the Baptist states that God could reconstitute the Jews, if he had to raise them up from stones. Quote, and think not to say within yourselves, we have Abraham to our father, for I say unto you, that God is able of these stones to raise up children unto Abraham. End quote. In fact, the new covenant itself was a reconstitution of Israel, so obviously you cannot maintain the hypocritical claim, they count when you want them to, but don't count when you don't. So if reconstitutions do not count, then John the Baptist was wrong in his statement, Christ was wrong in his teaching, and the new covenant is completely invalid. Or the counter-reformationist liar is wrong in his claims. But you can't have it both ways at the same time. You cannot disqualify reconstitutions when it comes to the 10 kingdoms, 7 of which remain, and then employ it when it comes to a future reconstitution of the Roman Empire, and then arbitrarily say it counts, there, just because you wish it to. It either doesn't count, or it does count, in both cases. If it does, then it's already happened. And it has. They just ignore that fact. Because they have to. The seventh contradiction major they teach is that they tell the public, chapter 13 is all about one person, and the text is one prophecy. It's all about 666. But the fact of the matter is that the chapter is divided even in the King James Bible into 2 sections, and given 2 separate bold headings. because it is two prophecies. There are two prophecies in chapter 13. Not one. And both prophecies are describing the beast. Both prophecies. So the beast is clearly not just a single person by the name of 666. 666 is part of the prophecy about the beast, but 666 is not a single person who is the beast. The beast is a reference to the kingdom, not a single person. Even in Daniel's prophecies, which John makes reference to, the coming kingdoms, the kingdoms were described as beasts, which he saw. John is prophesying the rise of a kingdom, not simply a person. The fact that they want to place this on one person at the end of time is enough on its own to tell you what they are doing and how they warp these texts. And why would you want to do that, other than the fact you are trying to avoid something? The eighth major contradiction they teach is that they want you to simply ignore the content of over 60% of the text in chapter 13, which clearly describe the rise of an absolute monarchy. The counter-reformation is trying to protect that absolute monarchy, so naturally they want you to just ignore all the references to it that exist within chapter 13, which amount to over 60% of the chapter. So exactly how are you going to correctly interpret a text by completely ignoring 60% of what it says? You have to become a pretty big liar and feel very comfortable with all that lying to do that as a minister. The ninth major contradiction they teach when preaching this chapter is that all John's references which are historically dated, such as his references to forms of government and weaponry, are all irrelevant and do not count. John didn't know any better. But as you saw in chapter 9, John is very specific about military equipment, and his references were amazingly accurate. And counter-reformation futurists claim John is describing nuclear bombs. How could John describe nuclear bombs in chapter 9, and then in chapter 13 call everything in the future, indiscriminately, a sword, because he doesn't know any better, only 4 chapters later? The 10th major contradiction they teach is that they intentionally hide its fulfillment in history. They know events have happened which fulfill these texts. But instead of inform their audiences this is the case, they hide those fulfillments behind excuses. The very fact you have gone through the trouble of making excuses to cover up their fulfillment shows you know there was a fulfillment there that needed an excuse, which you then made up. So it is not a matter of ignorance. It is a matter of intentional obfuscation. And counter-reformationist ministers have to lie about these events in history in order to hide them. Why hide something if it has never happened? The 11th major contradiction you have to tell as a counter-reformationist minister is that all these references to Christmas which are now happening throughout the book of Revelation all mean something else, and Christmas is a perfectly Christian custom. When the truth of the matter is, it is very much, explicitly and directly connected to the beast in the book of Revelation. It is called out in terms of its actual day in chapter 9, its deity in chapter 9, its purpose in chapter 10, its origin and institution in chapter 11, its politics in chapter 12. And here in chapter 13, you are going to see it once again, associated with the beast. And here John is going to prophesy about it in explicit detail. The 12th major contradiction you are forced to tell, as a counter-reformationist minister, is that none of this has anything to do with Nicolaitanism, when John has already made it perfectly clear, all this has to do with Nicolaitanism. In fact, he is prophesying the future of Nicolaitanism, and Nicolaitanism is the origin of the Antichrist and 666. Counter-reformationist futurists want to claim on the one hand that Nicolaitanism has all passed away, and on the other hand, the Antichrist is future. When John makes it clear, the Nicolaitans are the source of the Antichrist. You can't have an Antichrist without Nicolaitans. No Nicolaitans. No Antichrist. It's just that simple. If Antichrist is still future, then that means Nicolaitans are still here. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. Either Nicolaitanism has all passed away, and so has the Antichrist, or Nicolaitans are still here. And the 13th major contradiction you create is telling people 666 is a calculation. When the text makes it clear, John is not telling anyone to calculate anything. He said to use pebbles to enumerate it, count it on a list, count it in a sequence. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That is what enumeration is. There is no calculation involved in an enumeration. That is why the Counter-Reformation is always floating the word, calculate. Because if you enumerate, instead of calculate, the identity of 666 is going to become an obvious unavoidable conclusion, and it will not point to either Nero, or some distant future, at the end of the world. That is why the need for the false word, calculate. So those are the 13 major contradictions counter-reformationists will preach or teach when they begin telling you what is in chapter 13 of the book of Revelation. You can remember the 13 major contradictions because this is the 13th chapter. And they teach one for every chapter that precedes. 13 major contradictions for chapter 13 of Revelation. When you see them, you will know what you were told here was the truth. And you will see them. If you are a counter-reformationist minister, it takes a great deal of lying to preach your way through the book of Revelation. And the only way you can do that is sear your conscience, or not particularly care what is in the text to begin with. And now we are going to look at what all that counter-reformation lying has been designed to hide from the public, in the historical fulfillment of the first prophecy in Revelation chapter 13 verses 1 through 10. Our historical timeline begins in the year 285, when the Roman Empire went through a major organizational restructuring to accommodate its increased size. What we have are a series of 9 prophecies that John writes, which he prefaces with a reference to Daniel's prophecies about the 10 horns. So John is picking up his prophetic narrative where Daniel introduces the 10 horns. Here are a summary of our 9 prophetic statements in the first prophecy, in Revelation chapter 13. Along with our previously constructed historical timeline. In verse 1, John sees Daniel's 10 horns emerging. And the name blasphemy. In the year 312 AD. That is our first prophecy. In verse 2, John references the leopard, bear and lion to describe his kingdom, and states that the dragon, which is the Roman Caesar, gives him his power and throne. This occurs in the year 313 AD. And is our second prophecy. John states in verse 3, which is obfuscated by translators, that the likeness of a crucifixion is adored and worshipped by the people in the land behind the beast, which was the Roman Empire. The time frame for this prophecy is the year 314 AD. And this is our third prophecy. In verse 4, he states they will grovel to the beast, and refuse to stand up to him, for fear of reprisals. This is targeted to occur in the year 327 AD. In verse 5, John prophesies the coming of a blasphemous mouth for the beast, which will preach unopposed for 42 months. We have 2 dates of significance for this event. A beginning date of 387 AD, and an ending date of 1647. Both taken from prophetic dating from the 42 months given by John. That constitutes our 5th prophecy. In verse 6, and also our 6th prophecy, John states the mouth will blaspheme in 3 specific areas. He will blaspheme the sacred Hebrew name of God, the habitation of God, and those in the heavenly tabernacle, specifying the 3 specific areas of blasphemy. The mouth of the beast will preach blasphemy. In verse 7, also the 7th prophecy, John states the beast will fight against those who belong to Christ, and claim authority over all generations and people on earth. In verse 8, John prophesies that everyone will reverence the beast, who is not written in the book of life. This is the 8th prophecy. And finally, the 9th prophecy John writes is that the beast will have an assembly, and if you join it, you will be brought into captivity under the beast. But if you use violence to fight against it, you will be killed. So the solution is to do neither sin, but instead, remain patient and have faith. And that constitutes the 9 prophecies in Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 through 10. For futuralists, it has to be noted that if these prophecies have really happened, as historicists have claimed the scriptures actually teach, then there will be no rapture, no future tribulation, and no future Antichrist. The Antichrist has already been here for centuries. And we are currently in the bowl judgments, in history. So did these prophecies happen, and if so, how? Let's go down our checklist of 9 prophecies, and look on our historical time frame, and see if this has happened in history. Next. The first prophecy begins in chapter 13 verse 1. Our direct translation from the Textus Receptus reads as follows. Quote, "And I stood upon the beach of the sea, and I saw out of the sea a beast ascend having 7 heads and 10 horns. Upon his horns, 10 diadems and the name blasphemy." End quote. As mentioned before, the term beast refers to a kingdom, not a person, and the name blasphemy is an easily discernible reference by historians to the name of Caesar, who demanded to be worshipped as a god. The refusal of which led to the death and execution of thousands of Christians. But there is much more significant history behind this title than most Christians are aware. The title Caesar is actually not a title. Just as John mentions in verse 1. It is actually a family name. It became a title in history for the ruler of the Roman Empire. But guess when this change occurred in history? This change occurred during the year of the 4 Roman Caesars, the same year that John begins his description of the sealed judgments. If you Google this question, this is the information you will see brought up. Quote, "The imperial cult. This cult regarded emperors and members of their families as gods. On his death, Julius Caesar was officially recognized as a god, the divine Divus Julius, by the Roman state. This was really the first manifestation of Roman emperor worship." End quote. A little farther down the page, under the question "Is Caesar a title or a name?" if you click the down arrow, this is the text you will see. Quote, "Is Caesar a title or name? Caesar's Greek, Kaiser, is a title of imperial character. It derives from the cognomen of Julius Caesar, the Roman dictator. The change from being a familial name to a title adopted by the Roman emperors can be dated to about 68/69 AD, the so-called year of the 4 emperors." End quote. So you see, the name blasphemy was a very clear reference to the name of the Roman Caesar, which was actually really a family name, associated with blasphemy, just as John describes it. Although verse 1 is rather short, John is doing several things in this text. First, he is picking up Daniel's prophecy of a series of empire kingdoms which begin with Babylon, Persia, Greece and then end with Rome. In Daniel's description of the 10 horns, 1 little horn arises and devours 3, which leaves 7 remaining. The term beast does not refer to a person, but a kingdom. John sees a kingdom arising. He is on the island of Patmos, looking east, as Hydra ascends on the horizon from the sea. This places him geographically looking toward the city of Ephesus, where the narrative of what he is going to prophesy in chapter 13, and which ends with 666 in verse 18, will all begin. Our historical time frame for verse 1 is the year 312 AD. So what happened in the year 312 AD? Did a new kingdom begin to rise? Actually, amazingly, it did, just as John had prophesied. Both in this text and in the one to follow, the astronomical information was the constellation Hydra and the section of constellations Ursa Major, Lynx and Leo Minor. If you Google what time of year these constellations are most visible in the sky, they will all point to the month of April. So what happened in the month of April? As stated earlier, in the year 285 AD, the Roman Empire underwent a major reorganization. It was legally split into 2 halves, just as was described by Daniel in his vision of the statue with the 2 legs of iron. Although it was a bicameral division, this period is known as the Roman Tetrarchy. The word tetra is from Greek and means 4. But it was organized under an Eastern and Western Caesar, thus it was a bicameral division. The bicameral Roman Tetrarchy was brought to an end at the death of Galerius, in April-May of 311 AD. Quote, "The Tetrarchy was the system instituted by Roman Emperor Diocletian in 293 to govern the ancient Roman Empire by dividing it between 2 senior emperors, the Augusti, and their juniors and designated successors, the Caesars. This marked the end of the crisis of the 3rd century. Initially, Diocletian chose Maximian as a Caesar in 285, raising him to co-Augustus the following year. Maximian was to govern the western provinces and Diocletian would administer the eastern ones. Galerius and Constantius were appointed Caesars in March 293. Diocletian and Maximian retired on May 1, 305, raising Galerius and Constantius to the rank of Augustus. The orderly system of 2 senior and 2 junior emperors endured until Constantius died in July 306, and his son Constantine was unilaterally acclaimed Augustus and Caesar by his father's army. Constantine's victory over Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 left him in control of the western part of the empire, while Licinius was left in control of the east on the death of Maximinus Daza. The Tetrarchate system lasted until 324 AD, when mutually destructive civil wars eliminated most of the claimants to power. Licinius resigned as Augustus after losing the Battle of Chrysopolis, leaving Constantine in control of the entire empire. The concept of the division of the empire under multiple joint emperors endured until the fall of the Western Roman Empire. End quote. The Britannica Encyclopedia Online explains the following. Quote, when Diocletian abdicated on May 1, 305, Galerius became Augustus' senior emperor of the East, ruling the Balkans and Anatolia. Technically he was subordinate to the western ruler, Constantius Chlorus. But since Galerius had arranged the appointment of 2 of his favorites, Maximinus, his nephew, and Flavius Valerius Severus, to be Caesars in both East and West, he was in effect the supreme ruler. When Constantius Chlorus died in 306, Galerius insisted that Severus govern the West as Augustus, but he grudgingly conceded the subordinate title of Caesar to Chlorus's son, Constantine, who was correctly suspected of Christian sympathies. Galerius's supremacy was, however, short-lived. Severus was soon overthrown in 306, and killed by Maxentius, son of the former emperor Maximian. Galerius invaded Italy but was forced to retreat. In 308 he induced Diocletian and Maximian to meet them at Carnuntum on the Danube, and to declare Maxentius a usurper. On November 11, Galerius proclaimed as Augustus of the West, his friend Licinius, who had effective control only in the region of the Danube. In the winter of 310-311 AD, however, he became incapacitated with a painful disease. Fearing, perhaps, that his illness was the vengeance of the Christian God, he issued on April 30, 311, an edict grudgingly granting toleration. Shortly afterward, he died. End quote. Emperor Galerius died an extremely gruesome death. Quote, Galerius died in late April or early May 311 from a horribly gruesome disease described by Eusebius and Lactantius, possibly some form of bowel cancer, gangrene or fournier gangrene. End quote. Quote, it was at the insistence of Galerius that the last edicts of persecution against the Christians were published, beginning on February 24, 303, and this policy of repression was maintained by him until the appearance of the General Edict of Toleration, issued from Nicomedia in April 311, apparently during his last bout of illness. Galerius's last request, that Christians should pray for him as he suffered with a painful and fatal illness, was in vain, for he died 6 days later. End quote. The death of the Roman Caesar Galerius, in April of 311 AD, brought a sea of chaos and civil war to the Roman Empire, which was not resolved until the October of 312 AD, at an event known as the Battle of Milvian Bridge. And this brings us to the events of verse 2 in the year 313 AD. Next. As you have seen earlier in verse 1, John connects the prophecies he is going to write in chapter 13 to the prophecies of Daniel. And John describes the coming of this monarchy as a beast. The term beast is the Greek term, therion, and comes from thera, and literally means wild, as in a wild, or feral animal. In verse 2, John states the following. Quote, and the beast I saw was similar to a leopard, his feet is that of a bear and his mouth is the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave to him his power and his throne and great authority. End quote. In verse 2, John begins by mentioning the leopard, the bear and the lion, which we have already seen, had astronomical significance. But he also describes the rise of this new monarchy, which he refers to as the beast, as having the qualitative traits of these animals. A leopard being fast, a bear being ferocious and deadly, and the mouth of a lion representing its roar. Historically, however, these animals also represented three streams of history. The leopard stood for Greece and its worship of humans in the form of idols. The bear stood for Persia, and its emphasis on the worship of the sun. And the lion stood for Babylon, and as John mentions later in chapter 16 through 18, its mystery religion. Thus John is also indicating, this beast will be a mixture of all three of these historical sources. It will be a syncretism, or mixture, of all three of these historical influences. As we have discussed before, John is using the term dragon in the same way it is used in the rest of the Bible, to refer to the ruler of the empire. Just as it was used in reference to the king of Babylon and the Pharaoh of Egypt. Both referred to as a dragon. In Revelation, John is using that same symbolic use, to refer to the head of the empire. But also, as has previously been already mentioned, there was a very literal fulfillment in John's use of that symbolism, because the dragon was literally the military standard of the Roman Empire, which was carried into battle. And as you saw in chapter 12, this was the origin of its use by the British monarchy, who actually was part of the monarchy system in Europe connected to the Holy Roman Empire. In chapter 13, John states that the same dragon of the Roman Empire, which he is describing in verse 1, and which he sees rising up out of the sea, creates a new absolute monarchy, and is the giver of both its throne and its great authority. That is a very unusual prophecy historically, because most kingdoms are established through some sort of military conquest. But here, John is prophesying that this absolute monarchy will be given its throne and its great authority by the dragon, who did the military conquest, and simply gave this authority directly to the beast. He distinguishes the authority of the throne of this monarchy as not being a normal run-of-the-mill, routine throne. John says this throne has not just authority, but great authority. The Greek word being megas, as in mega power, or mega authority. And the year for this event is the year 313 AD. Did this happen in history? The answer is, absolutely it did, and it really couldn't have been mistaken for anything else when it happened. Within exactly 1 year after Constantine's victory at Milvian Bridge, in the exact year of 313 AD, the newly empowered Caesar, Constantine, granted to Pope Sylvester a grand Roman palace known as the Lateran Palace. And within that palace a literal physical throne, precisely as John had prophesied. This is a picture of the literal throne that was granted to Pope Sylvester by the Roman Caesar, Constantine. And just in case you didn't get the message that this really was John's prophecy fulfilled in history, the meaning of the very name of the Pope to whom this throne was granted, the meaning of the name, Sylvester, itself, makes it completely unmistakable. Why is that? If you look up what the name Sylvester actually meant in Latin, the meaning of the name Sylvester itself actually means, literally, wild. The very same meaning of the Greek word, therion, translated beast from the Textus Receptus. The very same meaning. Both the Greek word, therion from John's prophecy, and the meaning of the Latin name Sylvester, mean, wild. What are the odds of that being a random coincidence? So, we see, prophecy number 2, in verse 2 was fulfilled in history, in the year 313 AD, precisely as John had prophesied. In verse 3, we read, quote, "And I saw one of his heads as butchered to death, and the stroke of his death was adored and admired in all the land behind the beast." End quote. That was a retranslation of the Textus Receptus. But as you can see, a direct translation from the Textus Receptus results in a text that looks substantially different from the KJV English translation. In the KJV translation, we have the famous verse about a head wound of the beast being healed, and the world wonders after the beast. But those are not the words you will actually find in the Greek text. In verse 3, we come to one of the most odd translations, not only in the chapter, but possibly in the book itself. What makes the translation so odd is that there has been an inconsistent selection of tertiary definitions used to translate these words, to come up with the sentence you see in the English translation. And the problem with the tertiary selections is that the tertiary definitions that were selected actually contradict themselves in their associated meanings. For example, the term wound is chosen when the Greek word means to slaughter or butcher. In fact, it is the very same word used at the crucifixion of Christ just 5 verses later, and there it is clearly not interpreted to mean wound. The tertiary definition of healed is used, instead of the primary meaning of the word, to wait upon, as in adore. Even though, when the tertiary definition, healed, is used, it means to heal in the sense of the cure of a disease, not the healing, in the sense of a wound. A wound, which you don't even have, in the text. You have the word butcher, or slaughter, as in the very same word, used again in verse 8, to refer to the crucifixion. There is no wound, even present in the text, to be healed, even if you ignore the meaning of its use, to refer to the cure of a disease. The head is referred to, as being completely killed, butchered, or slaughtered, as in a sacrifice. All these linguistic gymnastics appear to be covering up the very simple prophecy by John. They would engage in what would be the very strange custom, to John, of adoring or worshipping a crucifixion. And the sacrifice of this crucifixion would not be Christ, but rather, the replacement of him, which would be their own king. They would have a false Christ, with a false crucifixion, which they would worship and adore. That was John's prophecy, in verse 3. The time frame for this event on our historical timeline is the year 314 AD. The question is, did this happen in history? And the answer to that question would be again a resounding yes, it unquestionably did. And, thus the need for the translation gymnastics to obfuscate this text from the public. In fact, this actually became an institutionalized practice. It is even known by the very same terms by which John prophesied its coming in verse 3. It is called the adoration of the cross. It was begun by Pope Sylvester, shortly after Constantine's ascent to power as emperor. Allegedly, a fragment of what was claimed to be the cross of Christ was presented to Pope Sylvester by Archbishop Macarius of Jerusalem, who was a celibate Nicolaitan bishop from Jerusalem and a participant of the Nicene Council. The task of finding the original cross was taken up by Constantine's mother, and she is credited with finding the original cross of Christ, despite the fact that the Roman execution stake, which Christ had been executed on, had never been either retained or considered worthy of veneration by his original followers, 300 years earlier. And the wood produced was, oddly enough, miraculously found under the Temple of Venus. According to the website archpit.org, the excavation for this true cross of Christ began by Macarius in the very year of 314 AD. Precisely as our historical timeline targets for this event, to the very year. But that is not all. John not only prophesies that they will adore the crucifixion, but that the crucifixion they will be adoring will not be Christ. It will be one of the heads of the dragon. The dragon, in the form of Hydra, was depicted with 7 heads. John says this crucifixion will not be Christ, but one of the heads of the dragon. This is clearly a symbolic reference, meaning it will be the Roman Empire, and its head they will be worshipping, not Christ. Ironically, in keeping with John's prophecy, the earliest depictions of Christ in visual art are called Christ, the Good Shepherd. These were nothing more than depictions of Christ as Apollo. Apollo was the deity worshipped by Constantine. But that is not all. Not only was Christ depicted as Apollo, the Apollo Christ of the Nicolaitans was even shown to be Constantine himself. So, John's prophecy that they would adore the crucifixion, and it would be the crucifixion of the head of the dragon, not Christ, was literally fulfilled, precisely as John had prophesied, even down to the very year of 314 AD. Verse 4 states the following, quote, "And they groveled to the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they groveled to the beast, saying, Who is like the beast? Who is able to fight against him?" End quote. Here John prophesies that because of the authority granted to the beast, there will be a lot of insincere groveling to their authority. Even when people realize what is happening is wrong, they will not oppose it, out of fear of the consequences. Our historical time frame for this prophecy is the year 327 AD. Did this happen in history? And if so, how? Everyone who studies church history is familiar with the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. We have mentioned previously that the celibate bishops who were convened there all represented a stream of Christianity known as Nicolaitanism in the New Testament. And none of them were biblically qualified to even be bishops by apostolic or New Testament standards. As has also been previously shown in this series, it was the Council of Nicaea that rejected the blood and flesh of Christ in the Jewish Passover, established in the Torah, and as was commanded by Christ, and continued to be observed by the real apostles. But what most people are not familiar with is that while the Council of Nicaea rejected the blood and flesh of Christ in the Passover meal, it was actually the Council of Antioch in 327 AD that required that rejection by the entire Roman Empire, the violation of which was punishable as an act of sedition against the Roman state. And thus John's prophecy targeting the very year of 327 AD. The very first canon states, quote, "Before the devout Emperor Constantine, beloved of God, the Council of Nicaea set forth a decree concerning the holy and valuable celebration of Easter. If anyone, therefore, presumes to disregard this decree of the Holy and Great Council, let them be excommunicated and expelled from the Church." End quote. Then Canon 5 states, quote, "If he refuses to submit even after his bishop summons him, if he continues to disturb the Church, the state should discipline him as a seditious person." End quote. Quote, "The state should discipline him as a seditious person." End quote. Sedition is the crime of treason. The Roman law against treason was known in Latin as the lex majestatis, which prescribed the death of the seditionist, along with confiscation of all their property and wealth. The confiscation of all property and wealth, as a result of the Council of Antioch in 327 AD, was confiscated and given to the Catholic Church. So in essence all one had to do to obtain wealth was accuse a rich person of heresy. And not only would they be executed, all their generational family wealth instantly became the property of the Roman Catholic Church. Theological debate was brought to a frightening and bloody end. Resistance to the doctrines and practices of Nicolaitanism became an instant death sentence. So we see, prophecy number 4 was fulfilled in the very year of 327 AD, precisely as John had prophesied. As you can see by now, once these prophecies are translated accurately, rather than obfuscated, the prophecies are fairly simple, straightforward statements, which are easily seen in history, given their time frame. When we come to verse 5, we see two verses that are actually part of each other, even though they are separated into two verses. They are two verses, which are part of the same prophetic statement. They are a description concerning three things. The first is the description of a preacher. The second is a description of the message being preached. And the third is a time frame for how long that message will have authority, as part of the authority of the absolute monarchy that John is prophesying is coming. Verse 5 reads as follows, quote, "And given to him was a mouth, preaching big and blasphemous. And authority was given to him to continue 42 months. End quote. Since verse 5 and verse 6 are both parts of the same prophecy, we are going to go ahead and read verse 6, and address their fulfillment in history, together. Verse 6 reads as follows, quote, "And he opened his mouth to blaspheme God, his name and his tabernacle, and those in the heavenly tabernacle." End quote. Verses 5 and 6 are small texts, but together, they have a lot of information in them. Counter-Reformation explanations of these texts are nothing more than ink blot, free associations. One site suggested, this is the Antichrist's PR director, giving press conferences against all the Christians who were raptured. Of course, such absurd explanations completely ignore the historically dated references in the text to kings and swords. Not to mention the fact, there is no rapture, and John makes repeated references to believers still on the earth in this very chapter, that this entity is still persecuting and fighting. So they are all obviously still there. Counter-reformationists usually simply ignore everything in the text, except for the reference of 42 months, which they take completely literally, ignoring John's references to Daniel, and the way prophetic dating was actually used, in the book of Daniel. But this text is a prophecy about preaching, and what will be preached. It makes reference to both the style of the preaching and the content of the sermons. The Greek word translated in the KJV, and most English translations, as speak, is the Greek word, laleo. It can be translated as speak or preach. It is the same Greek word for both English words. It is translated as preach throughout the book of Acts, in chapter 8, verse 25, in chapter 11, verse 19, in chapter 13, verse 42, in chapter 14, verse 25 and in chapter 16, verse 6. The only thing that determines the difference is context. And here in Revelation chapter 13 verse 5, the term is used, specifically, in the context of what is going to be preached. So the term should be translated here as preach, because it makes the prophecy of the verse more visible to the reader. When you do that, this verse becomes incredibly specific. You have a prophecy about the coming of a preacher, a style of preaching the preacher will use, and even a description of the specific content the preacher will verbalize in his sermons. And that is the gist of the prophecy. But you also have the prophetic notation that this preacher's message will exert a permanent lasting influence. And if you remain consistent with prophetic dating, this influence will last a very long time, and thus why John is mentioning it in his prophecies. But the text is about the authority of the preaching. The preaching is the focus of the prophecy, from start to finish. If you don't identify what John was prophesying about the preaching, then you simply cannot identify what on earth the 42 months are supposed to refer to. You have to just ignore it, which is precisely what counter-reformationists do. They simply ignore everything in the text, but the reference to 42 months, and fill everything else in, with free association. Which is not an honest way to deal with this text. There are only two ways this time frame of 42 months can be interpreted. One is to do as the Counter-Reformation demands, and take it completely literal, ignoring the precedent of how prophetic dating is calculated in the book of Daniel. But in which case, if you do, you are stuck with events, which would have all happened before the year 138 AD, because of John's description, given in chapter 11 verse 2. If you are honest, there is no other real available option for interpreting John's dating, other than precisely how these dates were interpreted in the book of Daniel. That means following the biblical precedent of historical dating. If we do that, it will give us the beginning date of 387 AD and the ending date of 1647 AD, to mark the end of the authority of this message, brought by what John describes as the mouthpiece of the beast. If this is all made up, there will be very little chance there will be anything there that fits John's description. But on the other hand, if this is real, the beginning and end of that time frame should put an unmistakable historical parenthesis around what John was describing in verse 5 and 6 of chapter 13. On top of that time frame, and on top of John's specific descriptions of the content of the sermons, we also have the astronomical information. As shown in the previous video, the constellation known in history as the Mouth was the constellation Piscis Austrinus. This constellation was known as the solstice fish because it was used to mark the winter solstice. That information also gives us the month of December. John prophesies two things to look for. The first is that the absolute monarchy created by the Roman Caesar, which John refers to as the beast, is given a mouth, or mouthpiece. And the second thing John prophesies is that that mouth will preach very anti-Semitic things, as indicated in verse 6, by a defamation of the Hebrew sacred name of God. So the question is, did this happen in the year 387 AD, and what continued out of these events until 1647 AD? Many commentators will apply that measurement of time to the papacy itself. But that is not really what the text says. It is referring to the mouth that John is prophesying, preaching blasphemy, not the existence of the papacy. It is focused on something that will be preached. So what is it, and what happened in the year 387 AD? If you Google the three things that John prophesied, the word mouth, the year 387 AD, and preaching, This is the page it will produce. And as you can see, as the very first listing on the page, will be a reference to a celibate Nicolaitan bishop from Antioch, which was the birthplace of Nicolaitanism, named John Chrysostom, or Saint John Chrysostom, as he was referred to by the Roman Empire. Amazingly, every time this name is uttered, you are invoking the actual fulfillment in history of John's prophecy in Revelation chapter 13 verse 5, about a mouth being given to the beast. Because the surname Chrysostom, as in John Chrysostom, is not actually his name. He was known simply as John of Antioch during his lifetime. The name Chrysostom was an honorific name given to him in recognition of his great influence in preaching. The name Chrysostom actually means the golden mouth, as in the very mouth of the beast that John had prophesied in Revelation chapter 13 verse 5. Chrysostom, or the mouth, is considered the greatest preacher who ever lived in history by many traditional state-sponsored churches, Lutheran, Anglican, Orthodox and Catholic. His most famous sermons were given in the first 2 years after being ordained priest in Antioch. They consisted of a series of 8 sermons against Jews, known as the Adversus Judaeos, which translated means, against the Jews. Chrysostom, the mouth, was very anti-Semitic and therefore enraged that Christians were still keeping the Jewish feast days, including the commanded observance of Passover, in Antioch. In order to stop this, and separate Jews from Christians, he preached the series of homilies, known as the Adversus Judaeos. His sermons were transcribed by his devotees and passed out throughout the city as anti-Semitic propaganda. The following comments are the words of Chrysostom, the mouth, quote, "The Jews sacrifice their children to Satan. They are worse than wild beasts. The Jews have fallen into a condition lower than the vilest animals. Debauchery and drunkenness had brought them to the level of the lusty goat and the pig. I hate the Jews because they violate the law. I hate the synagogue because it hates the law and the prophets. It is the duty of all Christians to hate the Jews." End quote. Quote, "It is the duty of all Christians to hate the Jews." End quote. One of the first synagogue burnings in history was inspired by the mouth, Chrysostom, quote, "Even his sermons on the Maccabees were not in praise of the Jews, but in order to emphasize the difference between Jews and Christians, and it is not a mere coincidence that the destruction of the synagogue of Callinicon took place immediately after a series of anti-Jewish sermons on the occasion of a procession in honor of the Maccabees in 388. End quote. The procession of the Maccabees was done by Jews during the celebration of Hanukkah. Chrysostom's anti-Semitism was not only just plain hateful, it was also theological error, because out of hatred for the Jews, he was rejecting the blood and flesh of Christ in the Passover meal. Chrysostom's anti-Semitism would be quoted for centuries to come to justify the many attempted massacres, pogroms and even genocides in medieval Europe, and become the inspiration for later groups like the Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan. It was the result of the Nicolaitan Chrysostom, also known as the mouth, and his promotion of anti-Semitism under the guise of Christianity, that Hebrew itself became a banned language, meaning even the very sacred name of God became illegal under Roman law, along with learning the Hebrew language to study the scriptures. But not only did Chrysostom ban the Passover among Christians and incite murder against Jews, he made another lasting contribution to what John is prophesying as the beast. Quote, "Christians in the early church didn't celebrate Christmas as we do today. In fact, for several hundred years the feast of Christmas was absent from the liturgical calendar. By the time of St. John Chrysostom, 386, the feast began to spread to Antioch, where Chrysostom was living during the early days of his priesthood. For various reasons his congregation wasn't excited about this new feast, and so Chrysostom preached a series of Christmas sermons to get them behind it." End quote. Chrysostom's promotion of Christmas, in reality, had more to do with his hatred of Hanukkah than it did his belief in Christmas. Chrysostom knew from the beginning Christmas was a lie. He even referenced Christ as the coming of the Sun, as in the sun, in his sermons. And he knew Christ himself had taught no such custom to his followers. Chrysostom, the mouth, was among one of the first missionaries on record and history, for rejecting the blood and flesh of Christ, and observing instead, the Roman birth of the Son. Not only did he advocate rejecting the Passover meal, which is the blood and flesh of Christ, not only did he incite centuries of mass murder and hatred against Jews, not only did he inspire the banning of the sacred name of God, he actually also advocated deception and deceit as acceptable tools for spreading religious views. In other words, one of the best ways to serve God, according to Chrysostom, the mouth, was to intentionally deceive people. And this was precisely the description the apostle gave of the practices of the Nicolaitans in the book of Revelation. Chrysostom, the mouth, was literally and obviously one of those whom John had described as a Nicolaitan. And for all this murder and mayhem, deceit and apostasy, inspired by Chrysostom, the mouth, is not only canonized as a saint, he is called the greatest preacher who ever lived. But John called him the mouthpiece of the beast over 2 centuries before he had ever been born. There are so many details given in this prophecy, it simply cannot refer to anything else in history. This is exactly and precisely what John was prophesying in these 2 texts. And if you doubt it for even a moment, then let the math itself persuade you, so you cannot possibly miss this reference. In fact, that is precisely why John gave the math to begin with. Chrysostom's sermons occurred in 386 to 387 AD. If you take the year 387 AD, and add the 42 prophetic months to it, it will bring you to the year 1647 AD. So what happened in the year 1647 AD? In the year 1647 AD, for the first time in history, Chrysostom's lie called Christmas was openly rejected by a Western European government. If this prophecy had nothing to do with Chrysostom and Christmas and his anti-Semitic rejection of the blood and flesh of Christ, why does the year 1647 AD work out to be exactly the very same year Christmas was for the first time in history rejected and overturned? The odds would be astronomically against such a major coincidence. There is no other reasonable explanation than this is precisely what the prophecy addressed, and precisely what actually occurred in history that fulfilled it. Even the astronomical sign of the solstice fish confirms this is precisely what John was prophesying. Not only were these 2 prophecies of verses 5 and 6 literally fulfilled in history, it was fulfilled to the very 2 years of John's prophecy, on both ends, the very year of 387 AD, and the very year of 1647 AD. Both fulfilled in an amazing way with amazing details, down to the very 2 years the prophecy's math produces. And by the way, the Counter-Reformation knows that is the fulfillment of this prophecy as well. That is precisely why they called him Chrysostom, the Golden Mouth. In the same way, as you will see later, they elected a pope named 666. This concludes our examination of the historical fulfillment of Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 through 5, which is the first half of the first prophecy. In the next video, we will complete the rest of the historical fulfillment of the first prophecy in verses 6 through 10. In this video, you saw that there are 13 major contradictions that Counter-Reformation eschatology creates in futurism and preterism as their explanations of Revelation 13. You also saw that in verses 1 through 5, the prophecy that the beast would rise from the sea and be given both the throne and absolute authority by the dragon of the Roman Empire was fulfilled in history in 312 and 313 AD. You saw that the prophecy that they would adore the crucifixion of the head of the beast was fulfilled in the year 314 AD, when a Nicolaitan celibate bishop from Jerusalem, along with Constantine's mother, claimed to have found the cross Christ had been crucified on, nearly 300 years earlier, under the temple of Venus. You also saw John's prophecy of how a preacher would come, whom he called the mouth of the beast, who would lead history into intense anti-Semitism, even to the point of preaching theological blasphemy, and even profaning the sacred name of God. Which occurred in the coming of John Chrysostom, who was literally called the Golden Mouth, from which came the name Chrysostom itself. In the next video, you are going to see the exciting conclusion of John's first prophecy in Revelation chapter 13. Thank you for watching.